was just yesterday that the wise men were here, and we had Christmas. But here we are on the verge of Ash Wednesday. So I invite you to come with me up the mountaintop. This is Mark's version from chapter 9. I know, we spent 2 whole Sundays in chapter 1. I want to set the stage for you a little bit. This is one of those Markan passages where some detail is given that is unusual for Mark. The number of days since something has happened. What is that something? The disciples have gone with Jesus to probably one of the most northern points that you can go to and still consider yourself in Israel, especially today. It's Caesarea Philippi. It is in the far north, very near and actually along one of the springs that feeds the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. At Caesarea Philippi, there is a pagan temple to Pan, and the temple is the front of a cave. Pan is thought of as a cave-dwelling god. And you can still see the ruins of the sacrificial goats along the wall next to where the temple would have been. Pan had the lower body of a goat. Therefore, the kinds of blood sacrifices that were made there. Odd that Jesus would go all that way into a very pagan area. And there is a brief in Mark interchange where Jesus wants to know, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. After which, Jesus begins to explain to them that the Messiah is destined for trials and tribulations, suffering and death, and then resurrection. They have no clue what he's talking about. And even though Mark doesn't explain it every single time after an episode, he does describe it frequently enough that you can imagine the disciples arguing among themselves as they left the area. So let's go to Mark and read about the Transfiguration. We're going to begin reading in the 2nd verse of the 9th chapter and read through the 13th. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Then they asked Jesus, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Jesus said to them, Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man, that he is to go through much suffering and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. 6 days after Peter, speaking for the disciples, he seems to be the spokesperson in all the Gospels, says, "You are the Messiah." And then they get an astounding confirmation on a mountaintop, of course, perhaps Mount Tabor, where they see Jesus in white. It's reminiscent of Moses coming down from the mountain shining, such that the people would cover their faces because his face was so bright. And they eventually asked him to veil himself. Brilliant white. And with Elijah and Moses. Now there's so many different things to preach on this topic. And we want to work our way to where I feel led by the Spirit to talk about today. But it is important to recognize the cast of characters. Peter, James, and John. Moses and Elijah with Jesus. Elijah and Moses have mysterious deaths in that Elijah never died. He rode to heaven on a chariot. Moses was alone. No one knows where he's buried. He was looking out toward the promised land, resting from many years of dealing with people. I once did a play for Transfiguration Sunday and recruited from the congregation 3 folks to be Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. And I could imagine and wrote into my script how Moses would have been encouraging Jesus maybe not to do something so drastic, because after all, people, even God's people, have a memory about as long as a goldfish, at least when it comes to being the recipient of great blessing. It only takes a short time for them to begin to grumble again. And Elijah, the wonder worker, who defeated all the prophets of Baal, he might have taken the tact of saying, well, how about a little demonstration of biblical proportions? We don't know what they talked about. We just know they're there. And just as Matthew is always saying in so many words that Jesus is the fulfillment of prophecy and Torah. In other words, he is living Torah, living prophecy. Here they are, embodied. Torah, because we refer to the Torah as the 5 books of Moses, and Elijah, perhaps the most flamboyant of all the prophets, the one with so many acts of power, and also the one that was often in trouble because he was at odds with the powers that be, like all prophets are. So an underlining of what it means to be the Word incarnate, the Word of God incarnate. To take all of the things that were written down in the Torah and in and by the prophets that tell us in every way, shape, and form how we are supposed to relate to one another and to God. And here is the living Word to do that. Of course, it is almost impossible for the disciples to understand that this ultimate triumph is anything other than that this triumph of God could be anything other than some massive show of force, a triumph of a military nature, of running the Romans out, of getting rid of those that were in the high priestly arena that shouldn't be there, and to restore the temple, to restore the land. And that to do that, it had to be a mighty, mighty force. And Jesus says, in effect, nope, not at all. Remember, he's the one that says those who live by the sword die by the sword. And Jesus is trying to teach that, first of all, violence begets violence. And no matter how much you think you may have stomped out something that is evil or against the will of God, or however you want to put it, that won't be the end of it. That violence will then rear its ugly head in opposition, because violence was what was used to try to stomp it out. Jesus refers to himself in Luke as the tender green branch, and is so saddened that here he comes, someone without a sword, with no curses or condemnation, although he has some pretty tense arguments and says a lot of woes. He is nonetheless pleading for people not to be destroyed, but to be redeemed. And he does it in the way that God created us to be, with acts of loving kindness, healing and wholeness and reconciliation. Yes, he calls those who need to be made accountable to account. Woe to you. But he doesn't slam the door on anyone. The disciples have no way of understanding this. And you know what? I think we are just as blind, deaf, and dumb to anything but the ways of the world ourselves. After all, might makes right is a cliche that applies in our world and has for a long time. Nations have always acted in a way that proves that if they think they're mightier, then whoever is less is less in every way. As the disciples are coming down from the mountain, trying to figure out what Jesus said, they ask about Elijah. Now, I don't know that this asking about Elijah is so innocent. I mean, after all, John the Baptizer has been referred to pretty commonly as the one preparing the way. He says himself, he's no one of importance, he's just preparing the way. But the gospel writers in general refer to him as an Elijah figure, as Elijah is prophesied to prepare the way of the Lord. And he uses a future, he is coming. And then he says, oh wait, it's not like you think. How is it, he asked, that they could do with him anything they wished? And then he goes on to say, let me just read it for you. He says, how is it then written about the Son of Man that he is to go through many sufferings and be treated with contempt? And then he goes on to say about Elijah, but I tell you that Elijah has come and they did with him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him. So Jesus is basically telling them, in another way, that the powers that be are going to exercise that might makes right strategy. And that is part of what is to come. One of the things that is so hard for us to understand is the relationship between suffering and glory, especially when it comes to things that actually touch our lives. There's a whole Christian movement based upon the idea that becoming a Christian means that you will not have any suffering, that you will be golden children, so to speak, that you will be prosperous, that everything will go your way, that you will be healthy and wealthy and self-centered. Jesus is so much opposite to that. He's not telling us that we're supposed to walk around with grim faces, sackcloth and ashes, moaning and groaning about how hard our life is. But yet we are asked to take up heavy burdens. We're asked to take on other people's burdens. We're asked to have an open hand, not a closed fist. And none of those things are easy. We're asked to turn the other cheek, to treat our enemies as well as our friends. If someone wants our cloak, give him our second one. If someone wants help carrying, carry it twice as far. And all of these examples are not without heavy weight in Jesus' time. It would be Roman soldiers asking you to carry things for them. Who wants to be nice to the enemy? And yet Jesus says that's what we are here to do. That we are to take the road without violence, the road of peace, the road of grace. Actually, we're supposed to follow Jesus along his road. And yes, it means taking up a cross, meaning we take on things that aren't always pleasant or always easy. I once was told that the Bible was the most irrelevant book in the world when it came to good common sense and surviving in the world. Because everybody knows that if you don't keep your swords sharp, if you turn them into plowshares, that you're certainly going to just be killed. And I said, yeah, maybe. But don't you think that if you keep those swords sharp and you insist on using them, that you're likely to get killed also? Is that any safer? The might makes right is so ingrained in us, it's hard to think otherwise. But we are asked to think that way. We have a visually engaging but fleeting glimpse of glory in the Transfiguration. And then, like we all do when we have mountaintop experiences, the disciples have to go down in the valley. And by the way, when they get there, they're going to be confronted with another case of discipleship failure. And they're trying to understand this, and they don't want to let go of the glory. And yet there's this death and resurrection thing. They're trying to listen, but they're not hearing. They can't quite understand. Peter doesn't have any trouble speaking, even if he's frightened, but he sure has a hard time listening to what God has to say, even though God says, listen to him. Listen to him. Can you imagine? And they still don't. We are coming to a season of Lent when we're asked to engage in the deep questions, not the easy ones. And when Lent comes in February, which is Black History Month, we have all kinds of examples that we can bring in of the way in which people can work for change without violence. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a wonderful book, a courageous book. Well, it's called The Courage to Love. It takes a whole lot more courage to love your enemies than it does to hate them. If there's anything that the strife and division that we've experienced over the recent years should teach us, it should be that. I am old enough to remember the kneel-ins, where 2 black and 2 white college students would present themselves at a First Church, like, First United Methodist Church of fill in the blank town, and just present themselves for worship. If they were turned away, they would explain again, they just came to worship. If they were turned away again, they would say, we do not mean any disruption, but we're not leaving. We're going to go sit down right over here, and we'll be here waiting to be allowed to worship. Generally speaking, what happened next was, well, we're going to call the police unless you leave our property. No, sirs, we're going to sit right over here, and you go ahead and call the police. It's okay. But we just want to worship. That's all. Bishop Woody White, one of the most loving people I've ever met, an African-American bishop from the Maryland, New York area, whose family was in Georgia, learned about how different things were when he changed trains coming to visit his grandmother and went from integrated to segregated and was warned multiple times the proper way to behave and how one should never even look at, much less even acknowledge, the greeting of a white person, especially a woman. And when he was in college and decided to do this thing, he was scared to death, and he was even more frightened when he arrived at the church and found out that the only people there were himself and another African-American college student. The 2 white college students had been waylaid. They were not going to make it. And Bishop White, scared as he was, went ahead and did what they were supposed to do and waited to be arrested. And then his fear reached a huge level. Without the white students there, he really believed that he would be hurt if not killed. Well, the police came and arrested the 2 young men and took them to jail. And Bishop White said that was when he learned that you can't believe everything you're told, that you can't put people in a bucket and think they're all the same. He found that he was treated well, in the sense that any prisoner is treated well. No one abused him. Nobody harangued him. He got a meal. He had a cell with everything anybody else had, and had conversations. It takes, in my mind, as much courage to lay down a weapon as to pick one up, maybe more. And we know how difficult it is to stay nonviolent, because even if your group is, there's somebody else that isn't, and that will come along and do bad things. At least that tends to be what happens usually. And even the nonviolent protests, the sit-ins, the kneel-ins, the marches without weapons, often in their Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, or their robes and stoles if there were clergy there, or yarmulkes because there were rabbis. That even that movement could not sustain itself because of the desire for the sword, for more radical violence. I know. If we're engaged in fighting inequality or poverty or homelessness or hunger or whatever we are engaged in, that is a result of poverty and underemployment or unemployment. I can understand how angry and frustrated people can be, but yet we should know by our experience that it is through ministries of service and love and grace and reconciliation and conversation that change is made. But it is not easy. There's just as much suffering involved as in any other thing that is worth doing. It is a long road, and we humans don't like to take it. We want to call down God to fix everything so that we can just go about our merry way, relying on God to always make it right. And yet, God has made it pretty clear that we have to do our part too. The road to God's glory is not a martial one. It is not one glittering with weapons. It is a road that is paved with something quite different. It is paved with the building of relationships in programs that are for reconciliation. And by the way, those always have to include accountability. Desmond Tutu in South Africa and his work there is a prime example. But we humans, Moses probably was right if he was talking to Jesus and saying, listen, man, these people will not be able to keep this in their little pea brain for more than about 15 seconds. But however true or false that might be, the beautiful thing is that God doesn't give up on us, and he keeps giving us another chance. He keeps hoping that we will not only hear his words, listen to his words, but we'll hear them. We'll not only see what he's doing, but we'll understand it. That we won't just think that, oh, well, that's just Jesus, and I'm not Jesus. But we'll think, that is Jesus. That is who I should be imitating. Because he is word, he is scripture made flesh. He is the teachings of the prophets with all of their woes and blessings made flesh. He's not just words, he's deeds. I remember being told many times in my life that things that are worthwhile are not easy. Things are worth fighting for, working for, sweating for, sacrificing for. And there are many things in our world today that as Christians should call us to live sacrificially. To be the people who give the hand ups, not just handouts. To be the people that say, yes, injustices need to be corrected. The right things need to be done. Not to put one group above another or to bring another down, but to be able to look at each other eye to eye as human beings, all created in the image of God. During the season of Lent, we'll be asked to reflect deeply about ourselves, our mortality, the breadth of time that we have to live on this earth, and what we do with it. We're asked to be something more than what our secular world calls us to be. And yes, it may be a tough road, but it is also one of great joy and fulfillment. Because it is a road that takes us to many other people. And our lives are so much richer the more abundant those people are that we have the privilege of walking with, serving beside, or providing service to. Whether we are listening to them or listening to God and realizing that both are speaking the same language. Or if we realize that it is only going to be by the grace of God that we're going to get through some things. We're going to be having a virtual Ash Wednesday service on Wednesday. I would love to have some folks be in the sanctuary because there is a lot of responsive reading in this. So those of you who would like to do that, I just need a handful. And you can be well scattered out in the sanctuary. Please let me know, because I'll be sure and record, if I do record rather than go live, at a time that is suitable for everyone. And you're all going to be able to participate. This is not a sacrament. And so you can administer your own ashes to each other. You will receive a packet, 2 by 3 inch packet of ashes, and you'll little instructions on adding the oil, and you'll have an order of worship so that you can fully participate. As I say, we will broadcast it for sure at 7 o'clock on Wednesday. And depending on whether or not I can get a few voices, we may record it at a different time so that it is convenient for them. I invite you, whether we are together or not, to keep a holy Lent, to be thinking now about the things that you can do, maybe that you've never done before. It doesn't have to be elaborate. It can be a very simple thing. Something you give up so that you can take up something. Something you give up so that the coins and the dollars that you spend on that thing can be given to something else or someone else. We are all struggling in many ways in this season. And I believe that this Lent is a great time for us to put our whole beings back on track if we felt this untethered, and to ground ourselves in God. Thank you so much for listening today. And before we go, let us join together in prayer. Gracious and loving God, we come to you as people who are raggedy. We are people who have moments of wonderful golden promise, and yet we can be tattered and torn. And so we come to you in this last Sunday of the season of Epiphany in anticipation of a season of Lent, of a season of preparation for your passion and your resurrection. Father, this is the most holy time of the year that is coming upon us. May we dedicate part of ourselves to the contemplation and the development of our holiness as well, our personal holiness, our social holiness. May we renew our vows of presence, gifts, and service, wrapped in prayer for the church and for your work in the world. May we not forget those among us in need, those who mourn. May we do all that we can to be your hands and your heart in their lives. Guide us through the dark times. Remind us of your presence. Let us never neglect to do all that we can to reflect your light into the world. And rest in the knowledge that you are our perfect parent, loving, cajoling, directing, and whatever else you can do to get our attention so that we will hear your voice, follow your lead, and transform your creation. And because we are your children, we can raise our voices in the prayer that you taught your disciples to say when they prayed together, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. May your first day of the week be a glorious one. And may you come back to join us again Wednesday as we begin the holy season of Lent. And now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the people of God said, Amen.